The 9-year-old boy stood in the freezing corridor of the juvenile labor colony near Gorky, his small hands cuffed behind his back. It was 1946, and Vladislav Kirpichev had just become one of the youngest inmates in the Soviet penal system. The guards laughed as they processed him, a stick-thin child who had survived the Leningrad Blockade, only to end up here for stealing food. They had no idea they were looking at a future crime lord who would spend the next 50 years manipulating the Soviet justice system, building a criminal empire, and ultimately dying in a hail of bullets on a St. Petersburg street. Kirpichev's story begins not in criminal ambition, but in desperation and survival. Born in 1937 in Leningrad to a military family, his early childhood was defined by one of the most horrific events of World War II, the Nazi blockade of Leningrad that lasted from September 1941 to January 1944. During those 872 days, over 1 million civilians died from starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. Children watched their parents waste away. Families resorted to eating wallpaper paste, leather belts, and, in the darkest cases, worse. The city became a frozen hell, where human life lost all value and survival became the only morality. Young Vladislav was only 4 years old when the blockade began, and 7 when it ended. Those 3 years of witnessing death, starvation, and the complete breakdown of normal society fundamentally shaped his worldview. In post-war interviews, he would rarely discuss the blockade directly, but its impact was evident in his philosophy. Rules and laws were arbitrary constructs that dissolved the moment survival was at stake. The Soviet state had failed to protect its citizens, had let them starve in the streets while maintaining its propaganda machine. Why should he respect that state's laws? When the blockade finally lifted in 1944, Leningrad was a city of ghosts. The survivors were traumatized, displaced, and desperate. 7-year-old Vladislav found himself in a world where normal childhood didn't exist. Schools were destroyed, families were broken, and the black market was the only functioning economy. He began stealing almost immediately, not out of some romantic criminal calling, but because that's what survival looked like in the ruins of post-blockade Leningrad. By age 9 in 1946, Kirpichev had already developed a sophisticated understanding of theft. He wasn't just grabbing food off carts. He was observing patterns, identifying vulnerable targets, understanding the rhythms of street life in devastated Leningrad. But sophistication doesn't prevent capture, especially for a child. When he was finally caught and sent to the juvenile labor colony near Gorky, it should have been a warning, a chance to redirect his life. Instead, it became his criminal education. Soviet juvenile colonies in the 1940s were brutal institutions designed to break children and reform them into obedient citizens. The conditions were harsh, the guards were violent, and the older inmates ran their own hierarchies based on prison culture imported from the adult gulag system. For a 9-year-old, it was either learn the rules of this underground world or be crushed by it. Kirpichev learned fast. He absorbed the thieves' code, the jargon, the hierarchies, and, most importantly, the philosophy that divided the world into us, the criminal underclass, and them, the Soviet state and its servants. What happened next demonstrated the characteristic that would define Kirpichev's entire criminal career: audacity combined with careful planning. After serving 2 years in the colony, the 11-year-old escaped. Not in a chaotic, desperate dash for freedom, but in a calculated move that required patience and observation. He studied the guards' routines, identified weaknesses in the colony's security, and simply walked away when the opportunity presented itself. The fact that an 11-year-old could successfully escape a Soviet penal institution speaks either to the institution's incompetence or to the child's exceptional intelligence. Probably both. Freedom, however, was temporary. By age 17 in 1954, Kirpichev was back in the system, this time as an adult prisoner. He received 4 years for theft, his first adult sentence. This began what would become a pattern for the next 4 decades. Arrest, imprisonment, release, more crime, arrest again. But Kirpichev claimed he wasn't a bad thief. He was just too visible to the police. They knew who he was, they knew what he did, and they watched him constantly. In the Soviet system, once you were marked as a criminal, you stayed marked. The 1950s were a transformative period in Soviet criminal culture. Stalin died in 1953, leading to a mass amnesty that released hundreds of thousands of prisoners from the Gulag. But this amnesty also triggered a brutal conflict within the criminal underworld, known as the Thieves War. Traditional thieves-in-law, who followed a strict code forbidding cooperation with authorities or military service, found themselves battling suki, bitches, former thieves who had agreed to fight for the Soviet Union during World War II or otherwise cooperated with the state. Kirpichev entered adult prison life right in the middle of this ideological war. The conflict was vicious and personal. Thieves-in-law would kill suki on sight, and vice versa. The prison administration allegedly encouraged this violence, using the age-old strategy of divide and conquer to keep the prison population fighting each other rather than the guards. Inmates faced a brutal choice: align with the traditional thieves and risk death from the suki, or join the suki and be forever marked as a traitor to criminal traditions. From the beginning, Kirpichev oriented himself toward the traditional thieves' circle. He embraced the philosophy that a thief must steal, otherwise, he's not a thief. This wasn't just criminal activity, it was an identity, almost a religion. The thieves' world had its own laws, its own ethics, its own understanding of honor and betrayal. It was a complete rejection of Soviet society's values, a counterculture built on opposition to the state. But Kirpichev was never a simple follower of tradition. Even in these early years, he demonstrated the independent thinking that would later make him both respected and vulnerable. He studied the thieves' code not just to follow it, but to understand it, to see its logic and its limitations. He was becoming what one criminal authority would later call him, an encyclopedia of criminal traditions. The pattern of his life became grimly predictable: prison, release, crime, prison again. He claimed that not a year went by without him being detained or imprisoned. But here's where Kirpichev's story takes an unusual turn, one that demonstrates either genius-level manipulation or genuine mental instability, and possibly both. Instead of always ending up in regular prisons, he frequently found himself in psychiatric hospitals for forced treatment. Soviet psychiatric hospitals in the mid-20th century were notoriously used for political repression. Dissidents were diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia and locked away in mental institutions. But the psychiatric system was also used for criminal offenders who were deemed mentally unfit for regular imprisonment. The conditions in these hospitals were often worse than in prisons: powerful medications administered forcibly, isolation, and treatments that bordered on torture. Police and investigators remained convinced for decades that Kirpichev was brilliantly simulating mental illness. According to their assessment, he was a master actor who could convincingly display symptoms of severe mental disorders whenever it suited his purposes. Whether he was trying to avoid prison sentences, buy time, or simply find a different environment, his performances were apparently flawless. Medical professionals would evaluate him, observe his behavior, and conclude that he needed psychiatric treatment rather than criminal punishment. Was he really faking? The truth is probably more complex. A person who spent years in and out of psychiatric hospitals, whether genuinely ill or simulating, would inevitably be affected by the experience. The line between performance and reality blurs when you're subjected to powerful psychotropic medications and institutional confinement. Perhaps Kirpichev started by faking and ended up genuinely damaged. Or perhaps he had real psychological issues stemming from blockade trauma that he learned to exaggerate strategically. Either way, his ability to navigate between the criminal justice system and the psychiatric system showed a sophisticated understanding of institutional vulnerabilities. What's certain is that these experiences in psychiatric hospitals gave him a dark, cynical view of Soviet authority. He saw doctors who were supposed to heal people instead using medicine as a weapon of social control. He saw how easily the state could declare someone insane and lock them away indefinitely. And he saw that the boundaries between criminal, mentally ill, and political dissident were often arbitrary, determined by power rather than any objective reality. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Kirpichev cycled through prisons and psychiatric hospitals, building his reputation in the criminal underworld. He wasn't the most violent criminal, wasn't running major operations from prison, but he was becoming known for something else: his deep knowledge of criminal culture and his ability to articulate a philosophy of crime. While other criminals focused on immediate gains, Kirpichev thought about the broader picture: the role of crime in Soviet society, the relationship between the criminal underworld and the state, the evolution of thieves' traditions. He became an observer and critic of his own world. He saw how the thieves-in-law structure functioned almost like a mirror image of the Communist Party. Both had strict hierarchies, both required recommendations from existing members, both had ideological purity tests, both held regular meetings where decisions were made collectively. He would later mock this parallel, pointing out that becoming a vor v zakone, thief-in-law, required 2 recommendations from existing vori, a probationary period, attendance at criminal shodkas, meetings, and strict adherence to the code, just like joining the party. This critical perspective made him unique. Most criminals either fully embraced the traditions or rejected them entirely. Kirpichev did neither. He respected the history and saw value in the structure, but he also recognized that these traditions were products of a specific time and place, Stalin's Gulag system, and might not be relevant forever. This nuanced view would later cause him both respect and trouble. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Kirpichev had spent almost half his life in various forms of confinement. He had survived the Leningrad Blockade, juvenile colony, adult prisons, psychiatric hospitals, and the violent conflicts of the criminal underworld. He had seen friends killed, had witnessed the transformation of Soviet society, and had developed a comprehensive understanding of how power worked both inside and outside the law. But he was also getting older. The endless cycle of crime and punishment was wearing. Many career criminals either died young, spent their entire lives in prison, or eventually aged out of active crime. Kirpichev seemed headed for a life of perpetual imprisonment, perhaps eventually dying in a prison hospital or psychiatric ward, just another nameless casualty of the Soviet criminal justice system. Then came the 1980s, and with them, the first hints that the Soviet Union itself might not last forever. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika began opening up Soviet society. The economy started shifting, creating new opportunities for those willing to operate in gray and black markets. The iron grip of state control was loosening, and into that loosening space rushed entrepreneurs, criminals, and people who were both. Kirpichev watched these changes from inside the system. He saw how the old certainties were dissolving, how the rules that had governed Soviet life for 70 years were becoming negotiable. The state that had imprisoned him repeatedly was showing cracks. The economy that had no room for private enterprise was suddenly creating opportunities. And most importantly, the criminal underworld that had operated in the shadows was about to step into the light. By the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union entered its final years, Vladislav Kirpichev was in his early 50s. He had a lifetime of criminal experience, a deep understanding of how Soviet institutions worked, connections throughout the criminal underworld, and most importantly, a philosophical framework for understanding the massive changes about to sweep through Russian society. He had survived the blockade, survived the prisons, survived the psychiatric hospitals, and survived 5 decades of Soviet rule. What he couldn't know was that his most dangerous years lay ahead. The collapse of the Soviet Union would create opportunities beyond anything he had imagined, and dangers that would make prison look safe. The old criminal code he had studied so carefully was about to collide with a new generation of criminals who didn't care about traditions, honor, or the thieves' law. They cared about money, power, and survival in a chaotic new world where everything was for sale and violence was the primary currency. The stage was set for Kirpichev's transformation from a career criminal cycling through Soviet prisons to a major player in the brutal, chaotic, and incredibly lucrative world of 1990s Russian organized crime. But first, the Soviet Union had to die, and its death would be neither quick nor peaceful. The year 1991 marked the end of the Soviet Union and the beginning of what Russians would later call the Wild 90s, a period of chaos, opportunity, violence, and transformation unlike anything in modern history. When the red flag came down from the Kremlin on December 25, 1991, it didn't just mark a political change, it marked the complete collapse of the economic, social, and legal structures that had governed life for 70 years. Overnight, the rules vanished. For most Russians, this collapse meant poverty, uncertainty, and fear. Savings evaporated as hyperinflation destroyed the ruble. State jobs disappeared as factories closed. The social safety net that had guaranteed housing, healthcare, and employment simply ceased to exist. Elderly people sold their possessions on the street to buy bread. Professionals became taxi drivers. Chaos ruled. But for men like Vladislav Kirpichev, the collapse meant opportunity. Everything that had been illegal under Soviet law, private property, currency exchange, import-export business, casinos, private security, was suddenly possible. But possible didn't mean legal or regulated. It meant that whoever could seize these opportunities and hold them through force would become rich beyond imagination. The 1990s in Russia weren't about following new laws. They were about establishing control through violence and connections while the state was too weak to stop you. Kirpichev understood something crucial that many traditional criminals missed. The game had fundamentally changed. The old Thieves' Code was designed for a world where the criminal underworld existed in opposition to a powerful state. The code forbade cooperation with authorities, banned Vori from owning property or running businesses, and demanded they live purely from criminal proceeds. But when the state collapsed and everything became a gray area between legal and illegal, these restrictions became obsolete. The question was whether a man in his mid-50s who had spent decades in Soviet prisons could adapt to this new world. The answer came through an unlikely partnership that would define the last years of Kirpichev's life. He connected with Alexander Malyshev, a powerful criminal authority who understood that the future belonged to those who could blend criminal muscle with legitimate business operations. Malyshev was building something unprecedented in St. Petersburg, not just a traditional criminal gang, but an organization that combined extortion, protection rackets, and violence with ownership stakes in casinos, restaurants, and commercial enterprises. He needed people who understood both worlds, the criminal traditions that commanded respect in the underworld, and the business acumen to navigate the emerging capitalist economy. Kirpichev, with his encyclopedic knowledge of criminal culture and his philosophical understanding of the changing times, fit perfectly. According to law enforcement, Kirpichev became Malyshev's deputy for criminal affairs, essentially the organization's link to traditional criminal structures and the keeper of their criminal legitimacy in the eyes of the underworld. While Malyshev handled business operations and political connections, Kirpichev managed relationships with other criminal groups, resolved disputes according to criminal traditions, and maintained the organization's reputation in the thieves world. The Malyshev organization grew rapidly through the early 1990s. They provided protection to businesses, which meant businesses paid them monthly fees or faced violence. They controlled casinos and gambling operations. They had interests in the pharmaceutical trade, oil business, and various import-export schemes. The money flowing through St. Petersburg in those years was staggering, and organizations like Malyshev's took their cut from almost everything. But here's where Kirpichev's story becomes truly unusual. Despite his position in one of St. Petersburg's most powerful criminal organizations, despite his clear involvement in serious crimes, he was repeatedly offered the chance to be crowned as a vor v zakone, a thief in law, and he refused, multiple times. In the criminal underworld, becoming a vor v zakone was the highest honor. It meant recognition by your criminal peers as someone who had proven their commitment to the thieves' code, who had criminal authority, and who could make decisions binding on other criminals. Vori sat in judgment on criminal disputes, controlled the obshchak, communal criminal fund, and wielded enormous influence. For many criminals, it was a lifelong goal. Kirpichev's refusal was both principled and provocative. He publicly stated that the institution of vor v zakone seemed excessively formalized to him. He called most of the criminal rituals and symbols superficial illustrations of the thieves' idea, essentially performative nonsense that missed the point. He mocked the coronation process, comparing it to Communist Party membership procedures. He saw the whole structure as outdated, designed for the Stalin-era gulag, not relevant to the chaotic capitalism of the 1990s. This wasn't just philosophical musing. It was a direct challenge to the criminal establishment. By refusing the crown while clearly holding criminal authority and making money from criminal activities, Kirpichev was saying that the traditional structure didn't matter anymore. He was operating on his own terms, taking what he found useful from criminal traditions and discarding the rest. Some criminals respected this independence. Others saw it as arrogance and disrespect. The criminal world was splitting between traditionalists who clung to the old code and pragmatists who recognized that the new Russia required new approaches. Kirpichev positioned himself firmly with the pragmatists, but without completely abandoning his knowledge of and respect for criminal history. It was a delicate balance, and it made him both influential and vulnerable. What made Kirpichev's position even more unusual was his willingness, even eagerness, to talk to the media. Traditional criminal code demanded staying in the shadows, avoiding publicity, and never cooperating with journalists or filmmakers. But Kirpichev ignored these restrictions completely. He gave extensive interviews, appeared in documentaries, and became almost a celebrity criminal philosopher. The most famous of these media appearances was his interview with Alexander Nevzorov, one of Russia's most prominent and controversial journalists. Nevzorov's documentary, Kirpich, the Old Pirate, gave unprecedented access to a major criminal authority. Kirpichev didn't just talk about his criminal career, he philosophized about crime, society, morality, and the state. In one memorable exchange, Nevzorov asked Kirpichev what he would have become if he hadn't chosen a criminal path. Kirpichev's answer was brutally cynical. He said he would have become a cop because there's no real difference. When journalists expressed shock and asked if he'd never met a single honest policeman, Kirpichev delivered his famous response. "I knew one. He was lying with me in the madhouse." This wasn't just a joke. It was Kirpichev's entire worldview condensed into one line. He genuinely saw no moral distinction between criminals and law enforcement. Both were groups of people using force and institutional power to extract resources from society. The only difference was the uniform. In 1990s Russia, where police corruption was endemic and the line between criminal organizations and law enforcement was often invisible, this cynicism wasn't entirely unjustified. Kirpichev also appeared in Stanislav Govorukhin's documentary, The Great Criminal Revolution, which examined the transformation of Russian organized crime in the post-Soviet period. These appearances made him recognizable to ordinary Russians. People who had never interacted with the criminal underworld knew who Kirpich was. He became almost a folk figure. The old thief who survived the blockade outsmarted the Soviet system and was now getting rich in the new capitalist Russia. But media appearances weren't Kirpichev's only violation of traditional criminal code. His lifestyle was equally provocative. Traditional Vori weren't supposed to own property, weren't supposed to have families, weren't supposed to live ostentatiously. Kirpichev broke every single rule. He owned a substantial mansion in Rapino, one of St. Petersburg's most prestigious areas. The house had extensive grounds, greenhouses where he grew plants, and stables for horses. He had a young wife and was deeply involved in raising his daughters from a previous marriage, ensuring they attended the best schools. He drove nice cars, owned a snowmobile, and lived comfortably. Not vulgarly rich like some of the new gangsters, but certainly well beyond what a traditional Vor would allow himself. When asked about these obvious violations of the Thieves' Code, Kirpichev was dismissive. He argued that the code was created for a different time, for Stalin's Gulag, where Vori needed to maintain absolute separation from the state and its systems. But in the new Russia, where former Communist Party officials were becoming billionaire oligarchs, and where the state itself was effectively for sale, why should criminals maintain poverty as a point of honor? His argument had logic, but it also had self-interest. Kirpichev had discovered that making money through protection services, casino ownership, and other semi-legal businesses was far more profitable than traditional theft. His criminal ideology, as he put it, had significantly changed once he encountered the possibility of earning massive amounts without obvious criminal activity. This philosophical justification for getting rich allowed him to maintain his criminal authority while enjoying a lifestyle that would have gotten a traditional Vor killed or crowned down, stripped of authority, in earlier decades. But the 1990s were different. Many Vori were making similar compromises, running businesses, owning property, and accumulating wealth. The old code was dissolving in real time. By the mid-1990s, Kirpichev controlled significant portions of St. Petersburg's gambling industry. Casinos were one of the most lucrative businesses in post-Soviet Russia. They operated in a legal gray area, attracted massive amounts of cash, and provided perfect opportunities for money laundering. Controlling casinos meant controlling cash flow, which meant power. Reports suggested that Kirpichev had interests in nearly every major gambling establishment in St. Petersburg. This wasn't just about collecting protection money. He had actual ownership stakes. He was a businessman criminal, or a criminal businessman. The distinction had become meaningless. The money flowing through these operations was substantial enough that he could live in luxury while also maintaining his criminal relationships. But this success came with complications. On October 8, 1992, Kirpichev's relatively comfortable life was interrupted when he was arrested, along with Alexander Malyshev and 17 other members of their organization. The charges were serious: banditry, extortion, organized criminal activity. If convicted, they faced lengthy prison sentences. The trial that followed became a spectacle. Kirpichev, now 55 years old, found himself back in the familiar environment of a courtroom. But this time, the stakes were different. Soviet-era trials had been predictable. The state always won. But in the chaotic new Russia, with a weak government, rampant corruption, and unclear laws, criminal trials could go either way, depending on money, connections, and legal maneuvering. Kirpichev gave interviews throughout the trial process, continuing his unusual practice of public communication. He met with journalists at his Repinho mansion, where he presented himself not as a criminal defendant, but as a philosopher reflecting on his life and the absurdities of the justice system. One journalist described arriving at the house in a Toyota 4Runner, being welcomed into a home that looked like any other wealthy person's residence, and interviewing a man who spoke thoughtfully about criminal culture, Soviet history, and social change. During these interviews, Kirpichev continued his critique of the zakone system. He argued that the institution had become excessively formalized, that it was created as an inverted copy of Communist Party structure, and that it was no longer relevant. He pointed out that criminal coronations required 2 recommendations from existing vori, a probationary period, attendance at meetings, and strict adherence to rules. Exactly like joining the party. The whole thing, in his view, had become a bureaucratic ritual divorced from any real meaning. He also reflected on the generational shift in Russian crime. The old criminal guard, he argued, had missed the moment when young criminals who didn't care about traditions entered the scene. These new gangsters, often called banditi to distinguish them from traditional vori, used violence without restraint, didn't respect criminal hierarchies, and cared only about money and power. The thieves' ideology, Kirpichev suggested, had lost to the ideology of bespredel, total lawlessness. The trial dragged on from 1992 through 1995. The Russian legal system was overwhelmed, corrupt, and uncertain. Eventually, the case fell apart. Whether through legal defense, intimidation of witnesses, corruption of officials, or simply the incompetence of the prosecution, Kirpichev and most of the other defendants walked free. His release in 1995 should have been a moment of triumph. He had beaten serious charges, maintained his position in the criminal underworld, kept his business interests intact, and emerged with his reputation enhanced. He was wealthy, influential, and famous. For a man who had spent half his life in Soviet prisons and psychiatric hospitals, this was an incredible achievement. But Kirpichev's freedom came at a moment of escalating danger. The mid-1990s in St. Petersburg and Moscow were extraordinarily violent. Criminal organizations fought brutal wars over territory and business interests. Assassinations happened in broad daylight. Car bombs killed criminal authorities and businessmen with equal frequency. The state was too weak to maintain order, so criminal disputes were settled with bullets. Kirpichev's position made him a target from multiple directions. His control over casinos put him in conflict with other organizations that wanted those lucrative businesses. His involvement in pharmaceutical and oil trading brought him into conflict with powerful Moscow-based groups. His relationship with the Tambov criminal organization, one of St. Petersburg's most powerful groups, was deteriorating. Most dangerously, Kirpichev seemed to be losing his sense of the limits of his power. Associates later said he began acting like he was untouchable, like his criminal authority and media fame provided protection. He started making moves that challenged more powerful players. He attempted to bring vori from Kazan to St. Petersburg to strengthen his position, which was seen as an attempt to build an independent power base. He also had increasingly strained relationships with other criminal authorities. Some respected his knowledge and independence. Others thought he had become arrogant and dismissive. His public statements criticizing the zakone system had won him enemies among traditionalists. His wealth and lifestyle made him a target for younger, hungrier criminals who saw the old guard as obstacles to be removed. In early 1996, people began warning Kirpichev that he was in danger. The warnings came from multiple sources: criminal associates, law enforcement contacts, even journalists who heard rumors. He was told he had lost his sense of reality, that he didn't understand how vulnerable he had become. But Kirpichev either didn't believe the warnings or chose to ignore them. He continued his public life, giving interviews, managing his businesses, living in his Repinho mansion with his young wife. He had survived so much: the blockade, the prisons, the psychiatric hospitals, the criminal wars of the 1990s, that perhaps he felt invincible. Or perhaps he simply couldn't imagine a different way to live. He had been a criminal for 50 years. This was who he was. What Kirpichev didn't fully grasp was that he had become a symbol of a dying era. The independent criminal authority who rejected formal structures, who mixed criminal activity with business operations, who talked to journalists and lived openly. This type was being replaced by more organized, more violent, more business-oriented criminal organizations that operated like corporations, not like the romantic thieves of the Soviet era. The traditional criminal code that Kirpichev both respected and mocked was indeed dying. But what replaced it wasn't the philosophical criminal he represented. It was something colder, more ruthless, and less interested in criminal culture or history. The new generation cared about money and power. Period. They would kill anyone who stood in their way, regardless of that person's criminal biography or authority. By spring 1996, the situation had become critical. Kirpichev's conflicts with various powerful players were reaching a breaking point. His attempts to expand his influence were failing. The warnings about danger were becoming more frequent and more specific. But still, he continued as if nothing had changed, as if his decades of criminal experience and his philosophical approach to crime would protect him from the brutal realities of the 1990s Russian underworld. He had one more mistake to make, one final act of fatal arrogance that would seal his fate. The fatal mistake came during a conversation in spring 1996 with Vladimir Kumarin, one of the most powerful and dangerous criminal authorities in St. Petersburg. Kumarin, also known as Barsukov, controlled the Tambov criminal organization, which had become the dominant force in the city. The Tambov group wasn't like the old criminal structures. They were organized, disciplined, and incredibly violent. They controlled the oil business, had connections to political figures, and operated with a level of sophistication that made traditional criminal groups look amateur. Kumarin himself was a legendary figure, but also a deeply scarred one. In 1994, he had survived an assassination attempt that left him severely injured and cost him his hand. The attack had been brutal, a car bomb that should have killed him, but instead left him maimed. He survived through sheer toughness and received the best medical treatment money could buy, but the loss of his hand was a constant, visible reminder of his vulnerability. In the criminal world, physical injuries from assassination attempts carried complex meanings. They could demonstrate survival and toughness, but they could also suggest weakness, that enemies had gotten close enough to hurt you. Kumarin was known to be extremely sensitive about his injury. Smart people never mentioned it. They certainly never mocked it. Kirpichev, in what witnesses later described as an act of stunning tactlessness, did exactly that. During a tense conversation about business territories and the oil trade, areas where their interests conflicted, Kirpichev made a comment that crossed every possible line. He told Kumarin, "You didn't just lose your hand, Volodya, but apparently your head, too." The insult was multifaceted. It referenced the physical injury, suggested mental impairment, and used the informal Volodya in a way that could be either friendly or condescending, depending on context. In this context, it was purely insulting. Kirpichev was essentially saying that Kumaran had become stupid, ineffective, diminished, and tying that diminishment directly to the injury that had nearly killed him. Multiple sources later confirmed that Kumaran's reaction was cold and controlled, which, in the criminal world, is far more dangerous than hot anger. He didn't threaten, didn't shout, just ended the conversation. People who knew both men understood immediately that Kirpichev had signed his own death warrant. You could challenge Kumaran's business decisions. You could compete with him for territory. You could even be his enemy. But you couldn't mock his injury and expect to live. The insult was particularly stupid because it came at a moment when Kirpichev needed allies, not enemies. His aggressive expansion into the pharmaceutical business and oil trading had already put him in conflict with Moscow-based criminal groups. The Tambov organization controlled much of the oil business in St. Petersburg, which meant Kirpichev's attempts to establish himself in that sector were direct challenges to their interests. Additionally, Kirpichev's effort to bring Kazan-based Thieves Zakone to St. Petersburg was seen as an attempt to build an independent power base that could challenge the Tambov group's dominance. In the territorial logic of 1990s Russian organized crime, this was an act of war. St. Petersburg's criminal landscape was already divided among various groups, and any attempt to import outside authorities and redistribute power threatened the existing balance. The conflict between Moscow and St. Petersburg criminal organizations added another layer of danger. Moscow groups operated under the authority of established Thieves Zakone and maintained more traditional structures. St. Petersburg, as Kirpichev himself had noted, was more gangster-oriented, focused on new generation criminals who didn't necessarily respect traditional hierarchies. The Tambov group, for instance, never paid into the all-Russian criminal fund controlled by the Vori. They operated independently, which gave them flexibility, but also meant they had no loyalty to traditional criminal structures. Kirpichev, as someone who straddled both worlds, respecting criminal traditions while rejecting their formal structure, found himself caught in the middle of this Moscow-Petersburg divide. Moscow authorities saw him as an unreliable maverick who didn't follow the code. St. Petersburg groups saw him as trying to import Moscow-style authority systems that would challenge their independence. He had managed to make enemies on all sides. Throughout early 1996, the warnings intensified. Criminal associates told him he was in serious danger. Even law enforcement sources, who had tracked his activities for decades, passed word that something was being planned. The message was consistent. He had pushed too far, insulted the wrong people, and needed to either make peace or disappear. But Kirpichev didn't disappear. He continued living openly in his Rapino mansion, continued managing his casino interests, continued giving interviews. Perhaps decades of surviving Soviet prisons and psychiatric hospitals had given him a false sense of invulnerability. Perhaps he genuinely believed his criminal authority and public profile provided protection. Or perhaps he simply couldn't imagine living any other way. Hiding would mean admitting defeat, abandoning the life he had built. On the morning of June 13, 1996, Vladislav Kirpichev left his home in Rapino and drove into St. Petersburg. It was an ordinary business day. Meetings to attend, people to see, money to collect. He was 59 years old, wealthy, influential, and famous. He had survived the Leningrad Blockade, juvenile prison, decades of adult incarceration, psychiatric hospitals, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and 5 years of the most violent period in modern Russian history. The assassination happened in broad daylight on a St. Petersburg street. The details, like many such killings in 1990s Russia, remain somewhat unclear. Different sources provide different specifics, but the essential facts are undisputed. Professional killers, multiple shots, immediate death. Kirpichev never had a chance to defend himself or escape. It was efficient, brutal, and public, meant to send a message. The message was clear. Criminal authority, media fame, decades of experience, philosophical understanding of the criminal world, none of it protected you if you crossed the wrong people. The old rules about respecting criminal authorities, about criminal disputes being resolved through negotiation and criminal courts, about not killing well-known figures in public, all those rules had dissolved in the chaos of the 1990s. Power came from the willingness to use extreme violence. Period. News of the assassination spread quickly through St. Petersburg's criminal underworld, and then into the media. Kirpichev had been famous enough that his death was reported in mainstream newspapers. Journalists who had interviewed him, filmmakers who had featured him in documentaries, law enforcement officials who had tracked him for years, all provided commentary on his life and death. The investigation into his murder was perfunctory at best. In 1990s Russia, contract killings of criminal figures were rarely solved. The police were understaffed, underpaid, and often corrupted by the same criminal organizations they were supposed to investigate. Witnesses to such killings knew better than to cooperate with police. The professional killers were typically from out of town, did the job, and disappeared. Even when police had strong suspicions about who ordered a hit, proving it in court was nearly impossible. In Kirpichev's case, the list of potential suspects was long. Kumarin and the Tambov organization had clear motive based on the insult. Moscow-based criminal groups had motive based on his interference in their business interests. Other St. Petersburg criminal authorities who resented his independence and media profile had motive. Criminal competitors who wanted his casino empire had motive. The case was never solved, and likely never will be. What followed was the funeral, an event that revealed just how isolated Kirpichev had become in his final months. The service was held at the Transfiguration Cathedral, one of St. Petersburg's most prominent churches. In the criminal world, funerals of major authorities typically attracted hundreds of people, other criminals paying respects, demonstrating solidarity, showing their position in the hierarchy. Kirpichev's funeral was well attended by ordinary people, journalists, and curiosity seekers. He was a public figure, and people came to witness the end of his story. But witnesses noted something striking. Not a single major criminal authority attended. Not one established zakone, not one leader of the significant criminal organizations, not one person whose presence would indicate that Kirpichev died with the respect of his criminal peers. This absence was a statement as loud as the assassination itself. In the criminal world, attending a funeral shows respect and solidarity. Refusing to attend, especially collectively, indicates that the deceased died outside the community, that their death was sanctioned or at least accepted by the criminal establishment. It suggests that they had violated too many rules, made too many enemies, or simply become irrelevant to the power structures that mattered. The lonely funeral of Vladislav Kirpichev demonstrated that despite his decades of criminal experience, his encyclopedic knowledge of criminal traditions, his business success, and his media fame, he had died as an outsider. The independent path he had chosen, respecting criminal culture while rejecting its formal structures, building wealth while maintaining criminal identity, seeking publicity while claiming criminal authority, had left him without protection when he needed it most. He was buried at the Cemetery of Heroes of 1905, in a grave that matched his personality. Substantial, but not ostentatiously luxurious. The gravestone marked the resting place of a man who had survived horrors and thrived in chaos, who had understood his world deeply while ultimately misjudging its most dangerous currents. With Kirpichev dead, the question became who would control his empire? The casinos, the business interests, the protection rackets, the connections, all of it was now up for grabs. The prediction made after his death proved accurate. A major redistribution of criminal territories and spheres of influence began almost immediately. The casino business he had controlled was divided among various groups. Some went to the Tambov organization, some to other St. Petersburg criminals, some to Moscow-based interests. The pharmaceutical and oil businesses he had been trying to enter were absorbed by those who already controlled them. His mansion in Rapino, his possessions, his wealth, all redistributed according to the logic of power and violence that governed 1990s Russia. The redistribution process was itself violent. Various criminal groups competed for pieces of Kirpichev's former empire, leading to more assassinations, more bombings, more street violence. St. Petersburg, in the months after his death, saw an escalation in criminal warfare as different factions fought over the territories and businesses he had left behind. But beyond the immediate redistribution of his criminal assets, Kirpichev's death marked a symbolic turning point. He represented a type of criminal that was disappearing, the old-school thief who had come up through the Soviet prison system, who knew criminal traditions intimately, who could articulate a philosophy of crime. The new generation replacing him had no interest in criminal philosophy or traditional codes. They were businessmen who used violence as a tool, not thieves who saw crime as an identity. The zakone system that Kirpichev had criticized as outdated and overly formalized did continue after his death, but it evolved in exactly the direction he had predicted. Vori became more like business executives, managing criminal investments and legitimate enterprises. The romantic notion of the thief living outside society, refusing to cooperate with the state, maintaining poverty as a point of honor, all of that became historical curiosity rather than living practice. Looking at Kirpichev's life from the perspective of nearly 3 decades after his death, several conclusions emerge. First, his analysis of the changing criminal world was largely correct. The traditional thieves' code was indeed becoming irrelevant in post-Soviet Russia. The new criminal landscape required business skills, political connections, and organizational capacity more than adherence to historical criminal traditions. Second, his independence and refusal to fully embrace either the traditional or the new criminal models left him vulnerable. He understood both worlds, but belonged fully to neither. The traditionalists saw him as a violator of the code. The new generation saw him as an old man clinging to outdated notions of criminal authority. His middle position, while intellectually coherent, was strategically dangerous. Third, his willingness to seek publicity and explain his philosophy to journalists and filmmakers was both his legacy and his vulnerability. It made him famous and allowed his ideas to be preserved, but it also made him a target. In a world where most serious criminals maintained secrecy, his openness marked him as different and therefore dangerous to others who preferred operating in shadows. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, his story illustrates the fundamental truth about criminal power. It ultimately rests on the willingness of others to respect it. Kirpichev had criminal authority based on his biography, his knowledge, and his position in various organizations. But when he offended the wrong people and found himself without allies, all of that authority evaporated. Power in the criminal world, like power everywhere, is relational. When the relationships break down, the power disappears. The Leningrad Blockade survivor who became a career criminal, who outsmarted the Soviet psychiatric system, who built a casino empire in post-Soviet chaos, who philosophized about crime to television cameras. His story is distinctly Russian, but also universal. It's the story of someone who understood their world deeply, but not quite deeply enough to survive it, who saw the rules changing but misjudged the pace and nature of that change, who achieved success by breaking old rules, but died because he didn't understand the new ones. Kirpichev's grave in St. Petersburg remains a historical marker, visited occasionally by those interested in criminal history or the wild 1990s. The mansion in Rapino has changed hands multiple times. The casinos he controlled have been sold, renovated, or closed. The criminal organizations he dealt with have evolved, been destroyed, or transformed into semi-legitimate business entities. But the questions his life raised remain relevant. What happens when an entire society's rules collapse? How do people navigate between old and new systems of power? When is independence strength, and when is it fatal weakness? How much does understanding your world protect you versus making you arrogant? These aren't just questions about Russian criminal history. They're questions about power, adaptation, and survival that apply far beyond one man's life and death. Vladislav Kirpichev died as he had lived, on his own terms, defiant of conventional wisdom, caught between worlds. The 9-year-old boy in the juvenile colony, the psychiatric patient who may or may not have been faking, the career thief who rejected the crown, the casino magnate who talked to cameras, the criminal philosopher who insulted the wrong man. All the same person, all part of a life that spanned the Soviet Union's most brutal periods and its chaotic aftermath. His story ends on a street, Petersburg Street, in June 1996, but it began in the frozen hell of the Leningrad Blockade and ran through every major transformation of Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. In that sense, his biography is a historical document as much as a criminal case study, a window into how individuals navigate systemic collapse, how criminal subcultures evolve, and how the rules of power shift when empires fall. The lonely grave, the absent mourners, the unsolved murder. These aren't just details of one man's death. They're the epitaph for an entire era of Russian criminal culture, the moment when the old thieves' world finally died and something newer, colder, and more business-oriented took its place. Kirpichev understood that transformation intellectually, but couldn't survive it personally. That gap between understanding and survival cost him his life. The body of Vladislav Kirpichev was barely cold when the first bomb exploded. 3 days after his funeral, a car belonging to one of his former casino managers was destroyed in a parking lot near the city center. The message was clear. Anyone who had worked with Kirpichev, anyone who controlled pieces of his empire, anyone who might try to hold on to what he had built, they were all targets now. The summer of 1996 in St. Petersburg became a season of violence that made even the brutal previous years look restrained. The Casino War, as it came to be known, involved at least 5 major criminal organizations fighting for control of the gambling industry Kirpichev had dominated. Bombings, shootings, and disappearances became so routine that local newspapers started relegating them to inside pages unless the victim was particularly prominent or the violence particularly spectacular. The Tambov organization, led by Vladimir Kumarin, emerged as the primary beneficiary of Kirpichev's death. Within 6 months, they controlled most of the major casinos in St. Petersburg. Along with expanded interests in oil trading, real estate, and legitimate businesses. Kumarin himself would go on to become one of the most powerful figures in Russian organized crime, with connections reaching into the highest levels of government. The hand he had lost, the injury Kirpichev had mocked, became almost irrelevant compared to the empire he built. But Kumarin's success came at a cost. The violence required to consolidate control after Kirpichev's death drew unwanted attention from both law enforcement and competing criminal organizations. Moscow-based groups, seeing St. Petersburg as vulnerable and fractured, attempted to expand their influence. This led to years of intermittent warfare that killed dozens of people and destabilized the city's criminal landscape. Alexander Malyshev, Kirpichev's former boss and partner, had already been in prison when Kirpich was killed. He would spend years fighting his own legal battles, eventually being released but never regaining the power he once held. The organization they had built together was dismantled, its pieces absorbed by others. Malyshev lived quietly in his later years, occasionally giving interviews about the old days, but never returning to active criminal leadership. He died in the early 2000s, largely forgotten except by criminal historians. Kirpichev's family, his young widow and his daughters, disappeared from public view immediately after his death. They had money, presumably substantial amounts hidden in various accounts and properties, but they wisely chose anonymity over any attempt to maintain his criminal legacy. The mansion in Rapino was sold. The daughters, who had attended the best schools thanks to their father's criminal proceeds, went on to live lives completely disconnected from the underworld. They never spoke publicly about their father. The journalists and filmmakers who had featured Kirpichev in their work found themselves in an awkward position. Alexander Nevzorov's documentary, Kirpich, the Old Pirate, became a historical artifact, a window into a world that was already transforming even as it was being filmed. Nevzorov himself continued his controversial career in journalism and later politics, but the Kirpich interview remained one of his most memorable works, a raw, unfiltered conversation with a criminal who was willing to explain his worldview without apology or justification. The question of whether Kirpichev had been a vor v zakone remained disputed even after his death. Some criminal authorities insisted he had never been crowned and therefore had no legitimate claim to criminal authority. Others argued that his decades of criminal activity, his knowledge of traditions, and his influence in the underworld made him a vor in everything but formal title. The debate was ultimately meaningless. He was dead, and the world he represented was dying with him. The vor v zakone system itself underwent exactly the transformation Kirpichev had predicted. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, many vori had become primarily businessmen who used their criminal connections to facilitate legitimate enterprises. The old prohibitions against owning property, having families, and engaging in business were openly ignored. The coronation process continued, but it became more about business networking than criminal ideology. Some traditional vori tried to resist this evolution. They held meetings where they crowned down vori who had violated the code, stripping them of their titles and authority. But these decisions had little practical impact. A vor who controlled profitable businesses and had political connections didn't need the approval of traditionalists. The power had shifted from criminal authority based on adherence to code to power based on wealth, violence, and political connections. The St. Petersburg criminal landscape continued its violent evolution through the late 1990s. The 1998 Russian financial crisis temporarily disrupted criminal operations as the ruble collapsed and the economy contracted. But criminal organizations adapted faster than the legitimate economy. They had cash reserves in foreign currency, they controlled essential services and goods, and they had the flexibility to shift operations as conditions changed. By the early 2000s, under Vladimir Putin's presidency, the Russian state began reasserting control over both the legitimate economy and the criminal underworld. Some criminal organizations were destroyed through prosecution and imprisonment. Others were co-opted, their leaders given choices: work with the state or be destroyed. The most successful criminal organizations from the 1990s transformed into semi-legitimate business empires, their criminal origins obscured behind layers of corporate structure. The Tambov organization's trajectory illustrated this transformation perfectly. From violent gang to dominant criminal force to semi-legitimate business empire with political connections. The evolution happened within a decade. By the mid-2000s, asking whether the Tambov Group was a criminal organization or a business conglomerate was a question without a clear answer. They were both, operating in the gray zone between legality and criminality that characterized much of Russian business and politics. Kramarin himself eventually faced prosecution in 2007, arrested on charges including money laundering, embezzlement, and organized crime. He was convicted and sentenced to lengthy imprisonment, though even from prison he reportedly maintained influence and connections. His fall demonstrated that even the most powerful criminal authorities were vulnerable once the state decided to act against them. Perhaps the greatest irony of Kirpichev's story is that his analysis of the criminal world's transformation was largely correct, but his inability to fully embrace that transformation killed him. He understood intellectually that the old rules were obsolete, but he couldn't quite abandon them emotionally and strategically. He rejected the Vor v Zakon crown, but still sought criminal authority. He embraced business, but still valued criminal reputation. He criticized traditions, but resented younger criminals who ignored them completely. This ambivalence, this inability to fully commit to either the old world or the new, defined his last years and ultimately contributed to his death. In a moment of historical transformation, half measures and middle positions are often the most dangerous places to stand. You have enemies on all sides and allies nowhere. The Leningrad Blockade that began his story and the St. Petersburg assassination that ended it bookend a life that spanned the entire late Soviet and early post-Soviet period. From the siege that killed 1 million people to the chaos that killed thousands more, Kirpichev survived horrors that would have broken most people. His survival skills, developed during those 872 days of blockade when he was a small child, served him for 50 years. But survival skills optimized for one type of danger don't always transfer to different threats. The instincts that helped him navigate Soviet prisons and psychiatric hospitals, that allowed him to thrive in the early chaos of the 1990s, those same instincts failed him when the criminal world crystallized into new power structures built on business acumen and ruthless violence, rather than criminal traditions and philosophical coherence. Today, nearly 3 decades after his death, Vladislav Kirpichev exists primarily as a historical figure, a symbol of a vanished world. The Soviet criminal culture he embodied is now a subject for academic study and nostalgic documentaries. The thieves' code he both respected and mocked has been preserved in books and films, but no longer governs actual criminal behavior. The street. Petersburg of the 1990s, with its wild violence and unprecedented opportunities, has been replaced by a more controlled, more corporate criminal landscape. His grave sits quietly in the cemetery, a memorial to a man who understood his era deeply, but not quite deeply enough to survive it. The 9-year-old blockade survivor became a career criminal, became a casino magnate, became a media philosopher, became a corpse on a St. Petersburg street. The arc from survival to success to death compressed the entire Russian experience of the 20th century into one man's biography. And in the end, perhaps that's Kirpichev's real legacy. Not his criminal achievements or his philosophical insights, but his role as a witness to and participant in one of history's most dramatic social transformations. He lived through the collapse of one world and the brutal birth of another, understanding both, but belonging fully to neither. That liminal position, that in-between existence, gave him unique perspective, but ultimately cost him his life. The old pirate, as Nevzorov called him, sailed through storms that would have sunk most ships. But even the best sailors eventually encounter the wave they can't ride, the storm they can't survive. For Vladislav Kirpichev, That final storm came not from the state he had defied for decades, but from the criminal world he thought he understood. His death marked not just the end of one man's life, but the end of an entire era of Russian criminal culture, and the violent birth of something new, colder, and far more dangerous.